Okay, we've looked at what percentages are when we looked at pre-GCSE maths. If you started with the GCSE ones, you'll definitely need to go back to pre-GCSE just to look at the different percentages videos. And because they are topics that need to be covered for GCSEs, but because they're important at a pre-GCSE level, they're already done. Where we've got three different ways of showing a portion of something or part of something: percentages, fractions, or decimals, and they've got different uses. Fractions are good if we are showing equal parts of something and how it's chopped up and how many of those pieces that we got. So it's good when we're talking about things like maybe dividing things up between a certain amount of people. That one person should have 3/5 and the other person should have 2/5. However, they're not very good when comparing to each other because the denominator can be different. So for instance, if I said 3/5 and 4/7, which one has the bigger portion, it's then difficult. Percentages, on the other hand, show things in hundredths. So if you've got 10%, you've got 10 hundredths of something. But because they're 10%, 20%, and they're all essentially to the same denominator, that means it's easy to compare proportionally who's got the most. So I could say that one person has 20% and the other person has 60%, and you know the person with 60% has more. One problem with percentages is that it is affected by the size of the population that you're testing. So for instance, if I was comparing two classrooms and both of them had 50% had a C or above grades in a test, what if the first class had 2 and the other one had 50 students? Well, that means that 25 people got a C or above, a good result in the second class, but in the first class only one person got that. So percentages are good for comparing, particularly as there's no denominator involved, but they can be affected more by the size of the population you're gathering from. Decimals are very good for working on a scientific or mathematical basis and they're the ones we probably use the most. The reason being is they use the metric system of counting in tens. Each column is 10 times bigger than or smaller than the last one if we go into the right. So they very much deal with the system of counting that we're used to. When we're younger, we count in tens going up in each column. With the decimals, it works in exactly the same way. So it's easier for us to compare things and look at how much we've got with them. It's also good because most of our measurements nowadays, or a lot of our measurements nowadays, are used on a metric basis, on the basis of tens and hundreds. We can use decimals to represent that. One good example is money, where 100 pence is equal to a pound. So the first two decimal places would show us how many pennies we've got. If I said we have 25% of a pound, you might get confused. But if I said you have 0.25 pounds, because the 2 and the 5 are the first two decimal places, we know that it's 25 pence. But we sometimes need to convert back and forth between these different types of representing portions. So how do we convert percentages to the other forms? Well, firstly, let's have a look at converting percentages to fractions. Well, basically, like I said, the percentages are hundredths. So if I've got 23%, I've got 23 hundredths. If I've got 60%, I've got 60 hundredths. So when we've got a percent and we want to turn it into a fraction, we simply put the number over 100. We keep the percentage number as the numerator and 100 as the denominator. And then we've got to remember to simplify down. So in this case, 20 goes into both 20 and 100. Remember to have a look at the simplification video, and that'll give us 20 divided by 20 is 1, and 120 divided by 5 is a fifth. So 20% is 1/5. So what about percentages to decimals? Well, again, this is quite a nice easy one. All we've got to do is move the decimal point 2 to the left. So remember, when you've got a percentage, there's that invisible decimal place, which we don't draw because there's nothing on the right side of the decimal place. So in this case, when we had 30%, there's an invisible decimal place at a 30 point. Now, all we've got to move is that decimal place 2 positions to the left. So one move puts it between the 3 of the tens and the 0 of the units, and one move again puts it between the 0 of the hundreds and the 3 of the tens. So changing it into 0.30, so the decimal place has moved twice. But remember that we don't put zeros down in decimals if there's no other numbers above 0 to the right of it. So we just take that 0 away and we're left with 0.3. So a nice easy way to convert percentages to decimals.